Okay. All right. So thank you everyone for coming to the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre webinar today. So my name is Jake. I'm the Malaysia Country Coordinator. And so today with me, I have Assistant Professor Walid Abdullah, who's going to be the moderator for today. I have Professor James Chin from the University of Tasmania, and also Dr. Tricia Yeoh from the Ideas think tank, the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. So we also have Professor Greg Barton, who is currently running errands at the airport, so he will be joining us in a little bit later. But yeah, and so before we start the webinar today, I would like to just acknowledge that I am on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and where I am at today, and welcome from wherever you are joining us from today. And so with that, I would like to pass it over to lecturer Walid to kick off the proceedings for today.
Okay, thank you so much, Jake, and hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Apologies for just now, technical difficulties. So 1 year of Anwar Ibrahim's Pakatan Harapan government. So what can we make of it? So today I will be chairing this session, and we have three distinguished speakers with us, Professor James Chin, Dr. Tricia Yeoh, Professor Greg Barton, and I will be asking them a few questions, and maybe we can get the ball rolling with your answers for a while, for a few minutes, 3 to 4 minutes, and then we can open it up to the floor later on. And let's jump right to it. Right? So my first question is for the three of you. So is reformasi dead? So Hairi Jamaluddin, he said that the day after Zahid Hamidi was given the DNAA, he said this is reformati. And this is the unfortunate character arc of the Prime Minister. So is reformasi dead? Has the Pakatan Harapan government been unable to live up to the ideals of reformasi? So Prof Chin first, and then we go for Dr. Yeoh, and then we'll go for Prof Barton.
Very much, Walid. I start off by thanking Sydney Southeast Asian Study for the kind invitation for me to take part in this seminar. So before I answer the question, I think it's important I put in context my answer to that question. I just want to make several points about the Anwar administration. The first is that I think the general consensus among the Malaysian public is that after 1 year of the Anwar administration, things are not going very well. And if you speak to people in Kuala Lumpur, most people will tell you that the sure sign that the economy is not doing well is, for example, the ringgit is falling against two major currencies, the US dollar and of course the Sing dollar. This is quite serious because the Sing dollar, they look at a new psychological barrier of 4 to 1. The US psychological barrier is now 5 to 1. And also you look at the stock market, it's not really moved. I think the second point is that I like to make is that I think a lot of this is not really, not really its own fault. Part of it is the fact that we are not seeing a real coalition government, in the sense that this coalition was put together post-election. In other words, when you cobble a coalition government post-election, you have to live with a lot of compromises. The other problem he had the moment he took power is, of course, everybody understood that he did not have the, the Islamic vote or the Muslim vote, and that was reinforced in the 6 state elections. The third point I want to make is that since he became the government, of course, he had the right turn. And I think this right turn policy has not worked. I think we also have to perhaps talk about what were the key challenges he faced. I think by and large he did face quite a lot of challenges trying to make sure that the government was on keel, at least for the first 6 months, because everybody was planning for the 6 state elections. So to answer your question, is reformasi dead? My answer is that reformasi is not dead, but the problem is that Anwar's version of reformasi is very different from what a lot of other people think reformasi is. I think he's caught in a no-win situation where he's between a rock and hard place for all the reasons I've given, and I think going forward he will face really, really big challenges because it is quite clear that if you were to ask me, he needs a cabinet reshuffle because some of the ministers are clearly are not up to par. And also he will face new challenges coming up because Malaysia will install a new king in January next year. And of course, with two big terrains opening up internationally, not only about the Ukraine war, but we now have the Middle East, the Palestinian issue, and that has really affected the how should I say, the political terrain in Malaysia. So the bottom line is that reformasi is not dead, but the sort of reformasis the middle class or the Bangsa crowd is expecting are not the sort of stuff that he's interested in. He's interested in other stuff. The sort of reformasi that we can expect from Anwar will be the things that probably, if you have to look back, you have to look back much earlier, rather than the sort of reformasi we saw in 2018, because a lot of people are using that as the benchmark, because as you know, right, the Pakistan government were never able to fulfill many of the things they said they're going to do, because the government fell within a very short time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Prof Chin. By the way, you were a bit soft just now. I mean, I could hear you, but just a bit soft. Tricia?
Okay, hi, Walid. Thank you, first of all, to the SSEAC for inviting me to speak at this webinar. So 1 year of Anwar Ibrahim, 1 year of the not PH government, as you mentioned, Walid. So slip of the tongue. It's actually 1 year of the unity government, right? So we understand it's a coalition government cobbled together for the sheer purposes of being able to survive in the first place. So your question about whether reformasi is dead or on the cards, I would take a slightly perhaps different view from Professor Chin. While I think that reforms are there, my position would be that it's on the slow side. So it's not entirely dead. You do see some signs of reforms taking place. So I'll talk a little bit about the specific reforms that we are seeing on the cards or happening soon, in the coming months or the year. But I'll also talk about the things that are not actually happening. So the first thing that was just passed in this parliamentary sitting was something that was on the cards for a really long time under the Ministry of Finance's purview, which is the Fiscal Responsibility Act. For a long time, even organizations like ours had called for the FRA, because it really puts the onus on the government to create fiscal rules around how much, targets have to be set around borrowing and so on. And this allows for some fiscal, scrutiny and responsibility to take place. So that's good, but there are some gaps there. We also know, for example, that there are several that are on the way, and we know this because we're engaged quite actively with government. So things like the amendments to the Whistleblower Protection Act, the Government Procurement Act, which is very technical, but it's very important because procurement, as you know, is a source of potential corruption in the country. So that's happening next year. Passing of an ombudsman. So that's also something that we're hoping to see next year. And putting together of something on business and human rights. So again, all this is like next year. I think the problem here is that people are not seeing things happen as quickly as they should be. So it's 1 year in, many of these things have been parked at the Attorney General's chambers, at the office. Why is there not a speeding up process to just get things done much more quickly? One of the things that I think is further down the priority list, which I think is really important, is the Political Financing Act. So as we know, without the Political Financing Act, big incidents like 1MDB wouldn't have happened. If you don't have the Political Financing Act, today Malaysia doesn't have any laws or regulations that actually restrict where funds go to political parties. A 1MDB can very much happen again. But I want to circle back to what you said, and you started the conversation about the DNAA of Zahid, right? So given the DNAA, a lot of people's perceptions are that this is a big compromise. Everything else about reformasi goes down the drain. This is a difficult, sticky issue. We also issued a statement about it. And clearly, this has actually lost a lot of moral high ground from the PH, not government, but the PH as a coalition itself. But however, we actually are using that as an opportunity as well to talk about the separation of the AG and the PP. So again, if we go back to some of the institutional reforms that are required to ensure that such a DNAA does not happen again, actually you're talking about separating the offices of the Attorney General and the Public Prosecutor, which is happening. So last week we presented the Parliamentary Select Committee on Institutional Reform. So that's why I think my answer to your question is a little bit mixed. Reformasi is not dead. Those reforms that we need to have our institutions strengthened, robust, independent, they are there, but they are very slow. And I would urge, hopefully in the coming year, that these processes are much, much more sped up if we are to not pronounce reformasi all but dead. So I'll stop there for now. I have more things to say in the next question.
Thank you. Before I get to Prof. Barton, so for members of the audience, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A. Thank you. Prof?
Yeah, sorry for being out of the conversation for a minute. I don't think reformasi is dead, but it's certainly in a very perilous position. The current government is imperfect and disappointing on many fronts, but it's still surviving. And as long as it survives, there's the hope that it'll become a stronger government and a better government. I'm not saying that's easy or that we shouldn't be critical, but I think if we say that reformasi is dead, it's easy to go back and turn off the news and disengage. But what hope does that leave? It's not a plan of action, and I don't think it really. As I said, this is an imperfect government, but it's surviving and has the potential to become better. I was struck by James's piece today on the new king. I think that's a promising development. That doesn't solve problems in itself, but last November it was the intervention of the king that made a difference. The new king looks like he will do his best to try and keep open this democratic system. That's a positive sign.
Thank you. So I guess a follow-up question that maybe we can discuss later. So there seems to be a lot of apprehension, I suppose, in maybe criticizing the unity government too harshly because of the lack of alternatives and so on, right? And I'm thinking, what would it take for academics to definitively say, yes, reformasi is dead? Would Najib being pardoned, or would there be excuses made for that as well? Or would that be a red line? Because I thought Zahid being discharged, that would have been a red line, but it seems like that's not a red line. So what would it take for us to definitively say reformasi is dead?
Well, I think, to be fair, Najib being pardoned would be, disappointing and frustrating, but I don't think that should be regarded as a red line for regarding reformasi as being dead, because there's a limit to what Anwar's government has in terms of control over the royal pardons. I mean, technically, there's no direct control. Obviously, it would reflect badly on his watch, but I think that's sort of getting justice with Najib is one of the lesser priorities in a whole lot of priorities. I think if we see the government act in ways that completely sell out its principles on an open, plural society and a democratic society, then we begin to talk of reformasi having died, and that may come, but it hasn't come yet.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to the economy, which Prof Chin did talk about. So Malaysians, it seems, are not in a better place than they were economically during Najib's time. So has it gotten worse on the ground? What is the general sentiment like? Maybe we start with Tricia first, Dr. Yeoh, then we go Prof Chin, Prof Barton.
Okay, thank you, Walid. I mean, 2023, we're talking about Malaysia in context of both the region and the world. We are suffering from post-pandemic shocks. I think we never really came to terms with just how deeply our economy was affected. I mean, things, yes, we opened, if you just remember, the economy just opened in May last year. So you're talking about just a year plus since things opened, and there are still a lot of deep structural issues that took place during that 2-year period, which we have not yet really grappled with. We released a paper on this, on the kind of aid that was distributed, but even then the aid I think there are a lot of gaps, right, as to the kind of communities that were recipients of that. So it's number one, it's a post-COVID, post-pandemic situation. Number two, the Ukraine war. I think as far as food prices are concerned, that really sends our food prices up. We were already having high inflationary rates. So we have been grappling with these two things. Of course, this is coupled with existing structural problems of the country. And, a year in, it's difficult to address these deep structural problems. I'll talk about a few of them. We, number one, are seeing that the government is trying to do some things about the artificial prices. So the chicken ceiling price has been just lifted, like just literally as of last week. The egg ceiling price is likely to be lifted soon. There is targeted subsidy rollout that may start in 2024, as early as the first quarter of next year, possibly later if they don't get the data together. There's some subsidy rationalization of diesel and electricity, but we need to see that for petrol as well. But my point is that the government has to get all of these structural problems in order and tackle them. But while doing so, there will be corresponding criticism because there will be increased cost of living. And the problem is governments before today had never really the courage to address these structural problems. Whereas if you incrementally reduce these subsidies, which we know economically are not sustainable for the country, that will also mean the government has to come up with a very good system of targeted aid. So all this to say that we have to think about how things are in context. So that's one big point, that the structure of the economy is being tackled. It will take a toll on Malaysians, but I think somehow that period of suffering we have to go through this period, because if not, structurally further down the line, much more damage will be done. So that's one big point. The second big point I have is that government has rolled out a lot of plans recently, right? So just in the last couple of months alone, we saw the NIMP, the New Industrial Master Plan, being rolled out. We have the midterm review of the 12 Malaysia Plan, the National Energy Transition Roadmap, the new energy policy, the budget 2024. So like at least 5 very big policy documents. I think they were received well by the market, but to be honest, I think this is where I would concur with Professor Chin, that market is still quite dampened because I believe people are not really seeing any real movement or action on the ground. The real success factor in Malaysia, as far as the economy is concerned, is only in the semiconductor sector, but that's just one. We're not seeing anything beyond that. So the market confidence is a challenge, despite commitments to all of these institutional reforms that I talked about in the first answer, all the plans that I just talked about in this answer. I think the rollout, the action, the actual implementation on moving industry forward, that's not what we're seeing. So there's a discrepancy there versus, from action versus plans. And I think this is a gap that has not been addressed, has been addressed very poorly, I would say.
Thanks, Dr. Yeoh. Prof Chin?
Oh, okay, thank you. Yes, I think, how should I put this in a very polite way? Tricia's answer is exactly what you expect from an economic think tank about all these small policy changes. I want to talk about reality. The reality is that if you speak to most people in Kuala Lumpur, they're saying that, one, their wages is sort of stagnant. 2, prices have gone up, things are becoming more expensive. And number 3, they are, how should I say, they don't see a brighter future compared to, say, before the pandemic. The bottom line is this. If you speak to most economists, including you speak to the banks themselves, they will tell you, right, previously the EPU big thing was the top 20, middle 40, bottom 40. Now they don't want to use those figures anymore because there's sort of a general consensus that the middle class has sort of shrunk a little bit. Portion of it has dropped to the bottom part. So the bottom line for me is that, you can do all these things that Tricia is talking about, yes, but for the ordinary people, it doesn't sort of, it doesn't gel, it doesn't capture the mood. I think the point I was trying to make initially, the first round was, Anwar's government, actually, I was keeping a very close tab with a lot of people inside the government. I can tell you, for the first 6 months, very little stuff moved. Yes, there were policy papers shuffling around, people talking about changes, but very little stuff moved for the very simple reason people understood that the 6 state elections were coming, so they didn't want to rock the boat because they were trying to recapture the so-called Muslim vote. Then Anwar veered to the right because he thought that, by presenting Islamic credential, he could tap back a bit of the Muslim vote. That didn't happen. In fact, my own calculation is that the vote for the Perikatan actually, I'm talking about just the Malay segment, actually increased. You can see this very clearly in places like Selangor that Tricia knows very well. Most of the Malay majority seats all fell to Perikatan. So I think the problem with Anwar is that he's in a very, very difficult spot that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the big picture, and it will filter down to the small thing in terms of policy. How can he move ahead if the Malay majority, the Malay politics is not with him? That's question number one. Question number two, how can he pick the low-hanging fruit so that people feel the economy is moving ahead? You see, what we're actually talking about, right? I mean, on the one hand, we're talking about real life stuff. Things are getting more expensive in the supermarket. I mean, when I was in Malaysia recently, right, I was shocked. Imported milk was more than 10 ringgit a small carton. I was absolutely shocked. Or maybe I haven't been shopping that often. But the more important thing is that people feel, they feel that things are not moving, things are not getting any better. And the group that I see, which has the most pessimistic view of the Malaysian economy going forward, interestingly enough, is the middle class. People I know who has very good salaries, even they are complaining. So there is something that even all this small policy, even if you put in place, right, if you don't get the confidence of the market back, I don't know how you're going to move the country forward. So the bottom line is that unless he's willing to, for me at least, unless he's willing to do the big bang approach, I find it very difficult to believe that if you put in all these small things that you're going to turn around the economy.
Am I allowed to ask?
Please. Yeah, Carol.
Okay, no, I'm just curious what you would think like a big bang approach would be.
All right, the first step towards a big bang approach, right? He needs a cabinet reshuffle. I don't want to give any names, but it is there was sort of a unofficial consensus, at least among the people I speak in Kuala Lumpur. There was about 4 ministers who are just for lack of a better word, clueless. So and a large portion of the deputy ministers are also clueless. So we can start from there. A good place to start is really a cabinet reshuffle.
Thanks, Prof Chin. Prof Button?
Look, I agree with both Tricia and James. I think the reality is Malaysian economy has been dragged to a low level over decades of structural mistakes. Not just nepotism and corruption, but sort of the larger structural mechanisms that go with that for reasons that we're familiar with from previous governments. Basically this falls back on UMNO's decades in power and rentier economics. And that's not easily undone. It needs to be undone. That's the only way forward is to undo it. But it takes time to turn things around. So I think Anwar has to do 2 things, which are really tricky. One is he has to focus on the bottom 40% because that's where the real pain is being felt. But as James said, it's not just the bottom 40% who are feeling hurt. It's actually ironically the middle class, and what the middle class needs less than the bottom 40% needs immediate relief. The middle class doesn't necessarily need immediate relief, but what they need is a real sense of hope. And so Anwar needs to be much better at his communications to everyone, but including the middle class, saying, here is the plan, here's what we're doing, here's how we think it will work. It's not going to be overnight, it's not going to fix problems, but there is a future. There's a reason to hang in here and hope for the future. I'm not saying that comms, solves everything. It's certainly not, and it's easy to fall back on spin. But the opposition has been better at communications than the government has. We saw that with the state elections. We saw that with the federal election that led to the current government. Communication really is important because the middle class can get by. They're not immediately, I mean, they're in a tough position, but what they need is hope. What the bottom 40% need is immediate relief. And so Anwar can do both things, but it's not easy because he's turning around decades of basically, bad behavior by previous governments. And then, I'm not saying he's not in some ways part of that, but he is the one hope we've got for getting out of this at the moment.
Walid, I just have something to add. So I think when you asked, or rather someone said big bang approach, right? So if you're talking about bold approaches for the economy right now, like what can the government do right now? Because we know that, it's decades old problem of structural, failures. Number one is to address political appointments, right? So we know already that government-linked companies form a very large part of our economy, whether through state statutory bodies or government-linked corporations. Ideas does this very nice visualized tracker that you can check out, which looks at the political appointments on the boards of 137 federal statutory bodies, the FSBs. And we can see that the appointments were the largest under Muhyiddin, just because they had so many concessions to give out. So we're going to do that study even now for this current administration and to see whether it's still the same or it's going down. But the point is, why still do that? If you want to talk about confidence in the economy, reduce the political appointments to those boards. Number two, rethink the government role in the economy as a whole, because when you actually have a large percentage of government being active in the economy, that reduces private sector involvement, because we know that, private sector is supposed to be the one that spurs on economic activity in the country. And finally, really talk about real industry ecosystem. I talked about earlier how semiconductors are really like the only thing that we are very proud of today. What are the other kinds of areas that we are going to be able to attract talent? And then that's where wages can possibly go up, because, the government is talking about this new progressive wage policy, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. And even then there's some, negative response from industry. But the main thing is like, okay, government, create that ecosystem, companies will come, talent will come. But I think the political involvement and interference of government in the economy, that is a problem that has not yet been solved.
Thanks, Dr. Yeoh. So moving on to the final question I have, and then we'll take the audience questions. So we'll start with Prof. Watton. And in both your answers earlier, you seem to indicate that it's more hopeful rather than based on what you've seen so far. And the question I have is related to what you mentioned earlier about your own personal red line, which is on democracy and race and religion. So how has Anwar fared on that so far? I mean, it's 1 year, it's substantive, and Prof Chin has already said he's moving right further and further, and I think that's uncontroversial. So do you see him rolling back that, or do you see him just further moving right in order to capture the Malay Muslim vote?
I think, Wally, the temptation is definitely there for him to move further right. But I think the message to convey to him, to the extent that his office is listening, is that it's not working and it won't work. And in fact, it's what will destroy his government. So, ironically, for Anwar to survive, for this government to survive, he has to have the courage of his convictions. And I think his convictions are right, and not sell out to some sort of, compromise argued on pragmatism, because he needs to have the courage to lay down his political capital. It's limited, but if he has the courage of his convictions, he can make this work. If he gives up the courage of his convictions and tries to trade his way out with small concessions and compromises, he loses his political capital anyway, and he ends up with nothing. So, look, he may crash and burn, but better he goes trying than he dies a death of 1,000 cuts by compromising what he knows to be the right thing. I mean, we hold him to his word, basically, hold him to the principles that he's long espoused. He didn't spend 3 periods in jail for nothing. That deserves respect, but that respect won't be there if he sells himself out.
Thanks. Prof Chin?
So I think on the whole, I agree with Greg. I think Anwar needs to find a way to move back to the middle ground. But I also know that a lot of people around him are saying that, if you move back to the middle ground, the risks are too high. I think the other thing that we keep forgetting is that it's actually quite easy to pull Anwar down. His numbers are not as strong as people think. It is possible on the other side to put together a coalition fairly quickly. You only need, basically Sabah and Sarawak to move across and everything falls apart. So I think he has to think carefully what he wants to do. I think on the one hand, I think Greg is right. He's got to, double down on his political convictions and remind Malaysians that Malaysia is a plural society. But on the other hand, I also know that it's very difficult for him to build up any political capital if he doesn't have support from the Malay polity. So the question is that how do you bring or win back a portion of the Malay polity? The problem now is that, for lack of a better word, they're right at your doorstep now. Because what happened last year's general election, one of the most significant things that happened last year was that PAS for the very first time has managed to break out in a very big way the so-called Malay heartland states. They're sort of moving down towards the peninsula. They've never been able to do it before, and they've really done it. And I can say with confidence that I believe they've done it because the results of the 6th state election shows that, it's gone beyond the so-called Malay heartland states. So, it comes back to, I keep repeating myself, he's between a rock and hard place. What does he do? I really don't know, because every option that you give him, move to the middle ground, looks good on paper, but it carries a very high risk. Because if one part of his coalition jumps to the other side, the government falls. If he goes to the far right, in some ways, you can also argue that it's a high risk, but in terms of the numbers game, it's actually a very low risk. And I'll tell you the reason why it's a very low risk. It's a very low risk because the largest party in Pakatan Harapan is actually the DAP. They're locking basically the urban Chinese votes, and those people have no place to go. They're not going to abandon Anwar even if he moves to the right. The other thing is, the other big thing that came out of last year, which sort of bothered me a lot, and I'm still talking about it 1 year later, is that people keep forgetting, right? Politics in Malaysia now is really, really polarized. The two largest parties in parliament have nothing in common, right? The biggest party in parliament is PAS. They want an Islamic state. The second largest party in parliament is actually DAP. They want middle of the road, semi-secular state, plural society. So I think that's something that you have to bear in mind when you talk about the options, the political option he has. I'm much more sympathetic to Anwar than I sound. All I know is I come across as very, very hard, but basically my bottom line is that he has to think carefully about the risks he's willing to take. And also don't forget, a lot of stuff are coming up next year. And how should I put this? The way the system works in Malaysia, right? If you don't have a very strong government, right, you never go through the full 5 years. You hold the election the 4th year. So you only have about 2 years of getting ready, to get everything done. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Yeoh?
Okay, I think Malaysia is going through the two trends that many countries around the world are also undergoing. And those two trends are, number one, it's already been mentioned, polarization. Malaysia is not exclusive to this. You see the bottoming out and the hollowing out of the middle, not just here, but also in Europe, across the US, and even elsewhere. Number two, we keep talking about moving to the right. I just want to say that the reality is the middle is the right. So Malaysia's middle is no longer the middle that we conceive of. Malaysia's middle is much more right than we think it is, especially amongst, these liberal groups. So with that in mind, then we know what the political calculations are, not just by Anwar, but from all parties, right? What has his response been? Definitely not bold enough. I think that what's happening now is PAS and PN created such a successful narrative in the elections last year, which continued during the state elections this year, that it feels very much any other party is merely responding to that. So just responding to those, to the tune that's been created from that side. We don't have the answers here, but somehow, you know, if PH wants to regain this idea of the middle, there has to be a clear message, or creating their own message about what, about how policies that are open, liberal, and progressive don't necessarily mean negative outcomes for the Malay majority. How that is to be proven, we know that sometimes facts and figures don't actually change people's minds, which is bad for think tanks, because that's all what we're about, right? Facts and figures. But if we can couple, you know, facts and figures with a little bit more of an emotional narrative about how, you know, opening up policies, you know, less focus on necessarily Bumiputra policies, how this can actually elevate the well-being, both social and economically, of everyone, like all together, then perhaps this is something that needs to come across like every single day. Every minister needs to be able to say that. I have a final point about this, which is that, yes, we know that the phenomenon of the green wave and PAS taking the lion's share of votes, including in very urban Selangor, is the narrative of the day. But we also need to understand that took place because of the failure of UMNO to consolidate itself after the 2018 election. So there was not enough time for UMNO to regroup. In fact, it's still in shambles today. Their finances, their organizational capabilities, which had been built up for such many, you know, decades-long period of time, that has fallen in shambles. And so that's also part of the story, right? Like if UMNO were to, let's say, theoretically strengthen itself again, I would be curious as to where the votes would go to, because the vote for PAS and PN has also been shown by a study by Washida, that Hidekuni Washida, that showed that in fact people voted more as a turn away from an UMNO they no longer believed in, rather than a positive vote. So it was a negative vote rather than a positive vote. So I think that's something to keep in mind when we, you know, put a lot of we put a lot of what's the word, we invest a lot into the theory of the green wave. Thank you.
Yeah, so I wanted to pick up on that, right? So even in your answer, Tricia, so you were careful to talk about UMNO specifically and the failure, right? But what about the concomitant idea of Anwar aligning himself to UMNO and Zahid? And I think that's an important part of this story that somehow is almost always overlooked. Even just now in our discussion, we didn't talk about what that does to Anwar's and PH's credibility in being able to, and it slowly chip away, and we move the red lines further, right? Just now, I think I asked Prof Button, we move the red lines further in, because if I were to ask some people, some PH supporters last year, they would say this is an absolute red line. It seems that the red line would be moving further and further. Do you think this has an effect of, maybe Prof Chin is right, DAP, the Chinese would not abandon PH, but would they turn up enthusiastically, or even middle of the ground Malays, would they be would they not vote for the unity government? Would they not support because of the association with corruption and with UMNO?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if PH had not won some of the recent by-elections, then that answer would be very different. So the answer would be that, any association that UMNO has with PH or the PH has with UMNO would actually both lead down a negative path, because voters of both blocs would not support that allegiance, right? But you can see that in Negeri Sembilan, I mean, Negeri Sembilan is UMNO's stronghold. They did better there than in the other states, and of course in the recent by-elections as well, they still managed to pull through. But by and large, I think the original UMNO vote and support, I would say that they have not been sufficiently convinced, right, about this allegiance with, you know, for the lack of a better word, DAP. So let's just say DAP, right? Because I think affiliating with PKR would not be such a significant problem. They're from the same party anyway. And then the other way around, right? So what do PH supporters think about affiliating themselves with a corrupt UMNO, or rather an UMNO that has not yet gotten rid of its old baggage? I think for the majority of PH supporters, they would probably think that it is an acceptable compromise. And I'm not saying this to excuse this position. I'm saying it as corruption, as an excusable compromise when compared to the alternative of what's in store. So it's basically, would you rather partner with a corrupt UMNO or have what they would consider to be a conservative path in government, which for them is unacceptable? So I think, unfortunately, it is a sort of catch-22 situation here for all voters, right? So I'm saying that very interestingly, actually, the outcome of GE14 meant that no single vote block was satisfied with the outcome. No one was satisfied. You know, let's accept that as well. So moving forward, this is where people like us really want to center political dialogue and compromises on policy, because whatever the politicians want to do, they will do, but can we predicate that at least on some policy outcome? This is where, you know, things like confidence and supply agreements and memorandum of understanding, all these things are really crucial, because we demonstrate that there is political appetite for reform. There is appetite for all of the institutional policy changes that I listed earlier, plus more. And, you know, whatever coalition that is cobbled together can achieve that, that's okay. Because once you talk ideology, race, and religion, it gets very muddled. And also, there's no solution here. There really isn't. So let's talk about what policy reforms you can gain out of these compromises. And let's face it as well, compromises will be a natural phenomenon in any political debate, not just in Malaysia, all across the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So maybe we try to, Prof Vatan, did you want to say something?
Oh no, just I'm very much agreeing with Tricia. I think the reality is that Anwar has to convince his base that he's committed to reform, but there's a limit to how quickly he can change things. He needs to be, you know, doing all he can with DAP to say, stay with me on this. I know that we're not where we want to be, but there's some things that are going to take time. And he needs to be saying, with respect to UMNO, that look, we have to move away from a system of rentier, corruption and nepotism, because the world is watching us and we have to grow the economy. So he can speak of the bottom 40%. He can acknowledge that a large part of that bottom 40% is Malay, and speak of wanting to help them, but make it very clear that the only way he or any other government can reliably help them is to grow the economy. And the economy is not going to grow in the way we want it to grow without confidence coming back. And that means that the international, investing community is looking at Malaysia to see whether there's hope for the future. And if we just get stuck in a loop of appeasing special interests and populist language, that's not going to build confidence, not going to grow the economy. So he needs to settle that message somehow. I mean, I think it's entirely right. He can't just be reacting to the negative campaign of Perikatan. He has to sell his own positive message in a way that cuts through to ordinary people and is convincing.
Thank you. So maybe we can take a few questions at a time. So there's a question. This is more of a comment by Pin Lim. It's easy to blame the problems with our economy on the Ukraine war or COVID, but other countries in Southeast Asia seem to be doing better. So there's a question for Tricia from Greg. What would you be able to signpost key differences between the first PH government, the Ismail Sabri government, the Muhyiddin government, and the current government from an institutional perspective? Are there any substantive differences in institutions? And then maybe we take one more, and this is for Prof Button and Chin. So what intersection is there between conversations like this and the apparent rise of past support from young voters, and whether that is a long-term shift in the electorate or is that a short-term response? So people have talked about younger voters supporting past. So what explains that phenomenon?
Okay, thanks. I'll address Greg's question. So the question was key institutional differences, right, among the last 4 governments, including the current one. So I think the first PH government, they came in big bang approach actually. They came up with this big National Anti-Corruption Plan, NACP, very ambitious, like everything, all and sundry, like all put it in. But of course, they were not there long enough to be able to see those things through. So a lot of plans, but nothing could be rolled out at that point in time. But I think some of those things made quite good progress, but nothing was legislated for. Ismail Sabri was the government that signed the CSA with the opposition, if you remember. And they did get a lot of things through, right? They got the anti-hopping law through, they got Undi 18 through, even though Undi 18 started under the PH government 1.0. They also got the constitutional amendments through for Sabah and Sarawak, if I'm not mistaken, because PH also couldn't get that through. So actually quite a lot of things happened under Ismail Sabri's government. Muhyiddin government came first, right? Before Ismail, so I should have talked about that first. Muhyiddin government was very bad as far as institutional reforms are concerned, in my opinion, because that was the government that suspended parliament during COVID, which was very unnecessary. In fact, that was the first time we saw the Agong actually speaking up quite vocally against the government of the day. So I don't remember anything significant coming out from Muhyiddin's government as far as institutional efforts were concerned. And then the current government, has done, as I said earlier, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and now is considering next year things like whistleblower protection, amendments, and government procurement, and I hope political financing, as well as the separation of the AG and PP. There is one more thing that happened under the current government, which is the passing into law of corporate liability. So that's also been on the works for a long time. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof Chin, young voters and pass.
Okay, young voters and pass. Based on 4 or 5 studies that were published very recently, the only commonality with the young voters is that these two play a very important role in the way they think about how to vote. One is that a lot of the young voters were influenced by their families, and the second is, of course, the influence of the social media. There are some specific stuff, but these are the 2 common stuff that came up with that I've seen in these 4 studies that I've seen. Currently, there's a big study that's going on where they're actually going to interview them face-to-face, a really big study that will be coming out soon, hopefully. But based on the ones that I've seen, these are the 2 big factors, family influence and social media influence.
Prof Bhatta?
Yeah, like I certainly agree with what James and Tricia have both said. There's no question, as I said earlier, that the Anwar's government needs to be much better at communications. That includes, TikTok and other short-form videos, not in a stunt sort of fashion, because that's not going to work, but in ways that have clear, strong messages getting through that are digestible. And with young voters, you're speaking to at least two audiences with Malay young voters. One is people who are living in more rural areas and are poorer, and will vote with the parents and join their parents in voting a protest vote against UMNO, understanding quite reasonably that they've been sold out for years. And secondly, you've got better educated, more urban young Malay voters who could be persuaded in the long term to become, hopefully long-term supporters of Pakatan Harapan. If Pakatan Harapan can get enough of those voters in the longer term, it starts to become viable and starts to get out of this precarious situation. But both groups need to have a sense of confidence for the future. Both groups need to be persuaded that this government is trying to make structural changes which will help the poor and give confidence for everyone, and that there's hope that change will make from a future Malaysia that's very different from the one we've experienced for the last few decades. So there needs to be a really gutsy, compelling, but plausible selling of that message. And there needs to be an explaining of the economic reforms and institutional reforms that have been put in place. Actually, Anwar's track record, as we just heard, is reasonable under the circumstances. But he needs to explain that and give people reason to be patient with him and to hang in there.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a good segue into the next question. How should, and we'll start with Prof Button, how should Anwar position or market himself currently?
I think Anwar needs to explain that. I mean, I don't know how much the slogan of Madani has helped him. I understand where he borrowed it from. In Indonesia, it makes perfect sense. In Malaysia, people don't really understand it probably. But he needs to unpack what he means by that. You know, and I think he probably can point to Indonesia as an example of a, you know, basically Malay Muslim majority state next door, very similar in some ways, that has the confidence of global markets and is looking forward with confidence and is building a more equitable society. You know, that is an example of where Malaysia can go in a very successful way. Of course, the fact that Singapore has pulled miles ahead of Malaysia also speaks to you know, decisions made in the past. But there's a limit to how much you can explain to the voters and get that through with confidence. I think he needs to articulate that this idea of being a Malaysia that respects pluralism, respects diversity, that doesn't sort of, you know, double down on sort of simplistic religious slogans, is a Malaysia that actually has a chance of growing the economy and being good for everyone. And that's, you know, without getting into negative campaigning, make it clear that just promising the world in sectarian religious community terms doesn't actually bring about the changes in the economy. It doesn't bring the confidence of the world that Malaysia needs if it's to grow its economy. So he needs to find some sort of really cut through lines that he can communicate and use social media to communicate that well, and engage with more confidence in society so that it doesn't have a defensive, you know, trapped sort of sense coming through. If he doesn't do this with some confidence and boldness, then he's really stuck.
Thanks. Prof Chin?
I don't think I'm in a position to answer that question. If I can advise Anwar, I will be a consultant living in KL now. But putting the jokes aside, sorry, when I talk about consultants in KL, the emphasis is on the first three letters, CON. But anyway, if there's one thing I would like Anwar to do is really he has to deal with East Malaysia, and I think one way of doing it is that he really have to increase the number of parliamentary seats in East Malaysia. I'm not saying that the East Malaysians, the Sabahans and Sarawakians are better or more rational, whatever. But that will introduce a whole new set of dynamics into Malay politics. Because right now, right, all they worry about is the Malay polity, Malay polity, Malay polity. So if you can introduce, you know, a spanner in the works, so to speak, especially with the Sabahan Sarawakians clamoring for more than 1/3 of the seats in parliament, I think that will significantly change the political dynamics.
Thank you. Dr. Yeoh?
Is this a question on how Anwar should position himself?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, okay, let's start from the Madani framework, right? So that's the framework that currently governs, was supposed to govern all of his policies and economic outlook. I think that as far as the framework is concerned, it's pretty consistent with what he himself believes and subscribes to. The positioning, I think, is fine. It has to just continue, right? But it has to have some stronger ways of communicating what his vision is for the Malaysia that he wants to see. I mean, it's not like he hasn't been saying this, right? He has been saying about in his speeches, in his statements and so on, that it is he stands for a progressive and inclusive Malaysia, but yeah, somehow the ways these are communicated, I think, are not strong enough, and make it clear as well, right? Make it clear as well, like, why is it then that if he stands for an inclusive, progressive Malaysia, why is it then that certain things seem to have been done to placate the conservative right, and be clear with that statement? Okay, this is the reason why we need to do this. So for example, the big one would be what, I don't know, the banning of the Swatch LGBT watches, or what else has come up this year? There are quite a few
letters-
incidents, right, that indicate.
Letters in Malay.
What was that?
The letters to the
Oh,
civil
right.
service.
The letters in Malay. Yeah, so I think maybe what people are seeing is that there's an inconsistency in
Right.
policy and practice. But I think Malaysians, by and large, are quite practical, and we would be able to accept whatever decisions are being made as long as there's clarity about why these decisions are being done. So I think the mismatch of what is being said and what's being done, there needs to be some bridge that connects the what seems to be like sporadic decisions. And if the bridge that connects these sporadic decisions can be communicated clearly, then I think that would be the best way to position himself. I mean, even what we consider like placating the conservative right, like I said, if there are reasons for that, and I think for that, basically they did say that, okay, this is like, you know, majority of Malaysians cannot accept this. So making those connections clear enough for the majority of Malaysians, I think that's really important.
Thank you. Thank you. So there is a question here. So to what extent has education in the past 2-3 decades contributed to the shift to the right in Malaysian political culture? So school education specifically. So I'm assuming this is under the Barisan National Government, actually, education in school. Is that what has caused the shift to the right? Prof Chin first.
Right. So my take is that you can't sort of pinpoint just one single area and say that that is the reason why it shifted to the right. I think there are many reasons. In terms of my own take is that the reason why there is a shift to the right, the starting point is the competition between UMNO and PAS about who is more Islamic than the other. Then when you talk about the school system, you know, it's a bit difficult to pinpoint the school system, because if you look at the curriculum itself, it actually looks quite neutral. It is the private schools, the private religious schools, and that is one of the big black areas where a lot of things happen which we are not able to get a grip of. But I think the biggest change in Malaysia is the big competition between UMNO and PAS, and that significantly shifted the needle to the right. Because what happened is that within the Malay polity itself, right, the whole discussion was about, you know, change from Ketuanan Melayu thing to Ketuanan Melayu Islam. So the whole narrative changed. So the more they talk about this, the more all the other minorities are kept out of the conversation. And I think what we saw towards the end of the Mahathir era was that this ideology, right, became all-encompassing. It sort of, you know, taken hold of the not only the discussion about the Malay elite, because if you look at the Malay elite in the 50s, 60s, even I would argue up to the mid-70s, right, they were a very different group of elites. Today, the Malay elites are you know, very different. You know, a lot of them actually, you'll be very surprised when you talk to them. Actually, they believe that, you know, the Islamic route is actually not bad, and that Malaysia should try the Islamic route. So, so I would say that, you know, this process happened within one generation, quite interestingly enough, quite fast. But I would say that it's not just the education, but it's also a shift in thinking among the Malay political elite.
Prof Bhatt,
Look, once again, I find myself in furious agreement with James. It's very hard to disagree with James. Maybe we can find something we disagree on. But I think to put a fresh angle on this, UMNO for decades sold a Ponzi scheme. It was a Ponzi scheme on the economy, but also a Ponzi scheme in this false competition with PAS. I say false because it was promising something it couldn't deliver and shouldn't want to deliver it. And the temptation in politics is to, and it's not just Malaysia. Think about what's happened in America over, you know, from the Ronald Reagan period through to the Donald Trump period, and in play for next year's election. You promise something to a religious right, figuring it doesn't cost you anything, but actually the cost actually accumulates, and you find yourself in a position where you can't deliver. So you've got to stop playing that game. It's unwinnable. instead, I mean, I think Anwar intuitively understands this, that his sort of Madani vision is a vision in which a more Islamic Malaysia is a more equitable and more just and fair Malaysia, and a Malaysia that respects pluralism, which is what he sees from the inspiration of Reformasi in Indonesia. But he's not doing a very good job of explaining that to the key people who really matter. So he's you know, it's not just about communications, but when the decision was made to call, you know, Pakaran Harapan, it wasn't a bad idea. They need to get back to selling this message of hope, because if you don't have a message of hope, people in despair will reach out to people who make, you know, promises they can't deliver, but do it with more confidence than what you're doing. And so that's, you know, part of the secret is the psychology of the voters, particularly young voters, particularly young Malay voters. They have to have a reason for hoping that things will get better and that you're on the path of making it better.
Prof Button, if I could push back a little, right? So you said Anwar intuitively understands that and it's a communication problem, but a lot of this Islamization process started directly under his purview, right? When he was co-opted into UMNO, right? In fact, Mahathir is not an Islamist by any stretch of the imagination, maybe a Malay supremacist, but not an Islamist, right? One could very well say that a lot of these problems were Anwar's own making. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, look, it's a long story, isn't it? A long and complicated story. Yeah, you're right that Dr. Mahathir is a pragmatist, you might say, without principle, who sold out plural Malaysian society because he thought that he would, you know, do better out of selling his message of fear, and based on sort of what became ultranationalism. And Anwar was part of a generation that brought in a more Islamist, you know, that Abim generation brought in a more Islamist vision, which Mahathir didn't understand and didn't recognize the danger of. I would say in defense of Anwar, he's gone through a long journey and has changed his mind, has matured and has a more a complex and nuanced outlook. But he needs to explain that personal journey in a way that resonates with others who are on that journey and say, look, you know, I tried going this route. I thought that the answer would simply be Islam, but I understand now the answer is not an Islam which is narrow and hateful. It has to be an Islam which is confident about the future and confident about justice and confident about equality, and believes that that's the message that needs to be communicated to the world. So there's a way of doing this. It's working better in Indonesia than it has in Malaysia. But he you know, he in some ways he can be honest about his own mistakes in the past and make that part of this positive messaging.
Tricia, final word for you.
I just want to say that we need to also clearly distinguish in our minds and in our analysis what has been a religious development and what has been a development along the lines of ethno-nationalism. So religious conservatism, yes, that has taken place over the decades for various reasons. I mean, you can start from the Iranian Revolution, you can talk about developments in the Middle East, influences from the region, also from Indonesia to some extent. But I think what happens, or what is happening in Malaysia, is more than that, right? So if you're looking at the political narratives during the elections of the last GE14, as well as the state elections, or the TikTok videos, perhaps, are also indicative. The language that's used is very much an ethno-nationalist one. Yes, but the flags that are waved on that bus are actually much more than that. So what we're seeing from emerging from Perikatan Nasional today, very dangerous, because if you're using religion as the vehicle to lump on ethno-nationalist tendencies, narratives, that's dangerous. Even if the leadership themselves don't believe it, they definitely have negative consequences down the line. People on the ground start to absorb it, start to believe it, tool, than just talking about conservative religion as a whole. Because I have seen the differences as well among people that I interact with. Conservative religious, but for them, the red line is let's not go into the ethno-nationalism. So just something to think about.
Just quickly, is there a final word, just 1 minute from each speaker, and then we'll end the session. Prof Chin first.
Right. So my final word is that I think we will see some major political developments this year. As I said, those people who play this sort of game are already planning for GE16. So it's quite clear that they have to pull out all the stops. If Anwar has some big bang approach, he better start introducing them this year, because otherwise he won't have time to harvest the fruits, so to speak. I think the second thing that I want to alert viewers is that I think the sort of things that we see in Malaysia, the political instability we saw in the last 4 or 5 years, this is consistent with what we know with long-term authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes. Many of them, when they came out after a period of strongman rule, so to speak, we saw in the Philippines, we saw in Indonesia, right? They have to go through a period of instability before they find their sweet spot again. So I think the bottom line is that, as I said, Anwar is caught between a hard place, at a rock and a hard place. Yes, we should push him. We should push him to take a more middle approach. We should push him to do all the right things. But we have to cut him a bit of a slack as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof Button?
Yeah, returning to where we started, I don't think reformasi is dead yet, but it's certainly been threatened. It could all fail. There's no question. As James said, this government's large majority is not actually as large as it looks, because it could slip away very quickly. So he certainly can't afford to lose Sabah and Sarawak. That's really key. He needs to persuade DAP to hang in there, even though he's doing some things or not doing some things that they really want to see happen. And he needs to have the courage of his conviction to sell us a positive message that's hopeful, and explain particularly to young people that his government's making changes that are going to deliver by growing the economy so that everyone benefits. But it's going to take time to bring around these reforms. The damage has taken decades to make, and it's not going to be undone quickly. But if Malaysia doesn't have the courage to do these difficult reforms, then there's no promise, no matter what the slogans of the opposition are, we'll have a shrinking economy, or at least an economy that fails to meet the needs of particularly the bottom 40%, and that's a hopeless situation.
Thank you, Prof Button. Dr. Yeoh?
Thank you, Walid. I think number one, Anwar needs to surround himself with the right people, the right advisors. Actually are what will change the economy, will change how people view the government. Number two, I think it's been mentioned, cabinet as well. Cabinet cohesion needs to be very visible. I think right now, different people are doing different things. Only a few are visible. So the cabinet needs to have cohesive, but also visible policies. And finally, I think just to be able to make sure that the government is aware there is political capital for these reforms. There's sometimes this false distinction between governance and reforms on one end and the economy on the other hand. And people like to say that, okay, it's the economy is stupid and not think about the governance and the institutional reforms, but that's not true. I think we need to be able to see those things as one and the same, and the government itself should see that, and hopefully we'll see these reforms taking place. So thank you so much, Walid, as well as to all the panelists and the Sydney Southeast Asian Centre.
I think on that hopeful note, everyone, please join me in virtually thanking our speakers. It was an excellent panel, and hopefully next year we'll have 2 years of the unity government, right? And Jake will be organizing that hopefully next year. So I'll hand over the session back to Jake. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Walid, and also to Professor Chin, to Dr. Tricia Yeoh, and also to Professor Greg Barton for your time today. It was very insightful, and I really enjoyed, all of the insights that you've shared with us, and also to some of your answers to the questions, and also to some of those from our audience members today. So again, thank you very much for your time today, out of your busy schedules, and also to our audience members, thank you very much for your time in joining us. There will be a recording available later if you have colleagues that wasn't able to make it today. But again, thank you very much. And from the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, this is just one of our other portfolios as well. So we're looking at Indonesia, Vietnam as well. But again, we'll be organising more of these sort of webinars and in-person events as well. So thank you very much to everyone.